In the winter of 1915, an Austro-Hungarian army would fight its way through the Carpathian Mountains in some of the worst conditions of war ever seen. Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Germans, Croats, Romanians, and others, men who couldn't even understand each other's own languages, would struggle together through snow and cold that killed as many soldiers as the enemy bullets did. This multinational force held together through warfare that produced more casualties than Verdun and the Somme combined. Yet hardly anyone even knows about it. My great-grandfather was one of them, and while he survived severely injured, many would not be so lucky. 3 years later, and the empire that these men had sacrificed for would find itself collapsing around them. But not for the reasons that most people think. You see, in Austria-Hungary, the political system gave real power to only two groups, Germans and Hungarians. Everyone else felt kind of locked out. Now, the obvious fix may seem to be to federalize the system, give everyone a voice, and then maybe everyone will be happy. But the thing is, if you did that, you risked making the empire completely ungovernable. It was, after all, already struggling to coordinate between Vienna and Budapest, so adding 6 more power centers could paralyze everything. Yet not reforming at all meant watching resentment build up until something finally broke. And so the leaders of Austria-Hungary waited for 50 years. When things were stable, reform felt too risky. There was no reason to do it. But when crisis finally hit, it was already too late. Now, you may be wondering why any of this actually matters. Why does a person like me spend all his free time in a dark basement making videos about a long-dead empire like Austria-Hungary? Now, sure, I am a little bit weird, and I am definitely a history nerd, but here's the thing, it actually does matter. After all, one of our most important political entities today is multinational. Now, the European Union is obviously nothing like a 19th century monarchy, and that's not what I'm trying to say. But it's a voluntary union of democracies built specifically to prevent Europe from tearing itself apart in another war again. And in many ways, it has succeeded. But success brings its own questions. When you look at Europe, where people use the euro, cross borders freely, live under common regulations, yet struggle to feel represented by the institutions governing them, you start to wonder if there are patterns here worth understanding. So in this video, I'd like to dive into why Austria-Hungary's lessons matter so much for the European Union today. Allow me to take you back to the summer of 1914 when Austria-Hungary mobilized millions of men for war. This was not simply a German and Hungarian force with some minority conscripts reluctantly added. The Imperial and Royal Army drew from every region of the empire. Czechs came from Bohemia and Moravia, Poles from Galicia, Croats and Slovenes from the southern territories, Romanians from Transylvania, Ruthenians from the Carpathians, Italians from the Adriatic coast, and even Serbs from the military frontier. Not to mention, of course, the Germans and Hungarians too. These were dozens of distinct ethnic groups speaking mutually unintelligible languages, practicing different religions, and carrying entirely different cultural traditions. In spite of that, these armies would fight together for 4 years on multiple fronts simultaneously. They would together face the Italian army in the Alps and along the Isonzo River. They would fight truly brutal and horrific campaigns against Russia on the Eastern Front. They would battle in the Balkans against the Serbs and later the Romanians too. There were certainly desertions, and in the final months of 1918, when the empire was clearly collapsing and civilian populations were starving, there were mutinies and mass surrenders. But let's put this in perspective and acknowledge that this happened to every army in the war. Let's take, for example, Austria-Hungary's primary opponent, Russia, whose military collapsed entirely in 1917. There were mass desertions, mutinies, soldiers refusing to fight, and the entire Russian army essentially disintegrated while the war was still ongoing. This tells us something important. For the vast majority of the war, Austria-Hungary's multinational armies not only held together, but they absorbed truly devastating casualties and yet continued to fight. My point being that it's not something we'd expect to see from a nation that was supposedly on the verge of collapse due to ethnic tensions. This presents a significant problem for the standard narrative we tend to hear about Austria-Hungary. If the empire was really just a collection of oppressed nationalities barely held together by force, waiting for any opportunity to rebel against their Habsburg overlords, then why didn't the war trigger an immediate collapse, or at the very least, a collapse faster than Russia's? Luckily, recent scholarship has investigated this. Something other than simple coercion was operating here, something the conventional story about inevitable ethnic conflict completely misses. So let's start with this question. What actually held the Austro-Hungarian army together? Now, as we've already mentioned, the imperial and royal army was designed to be multinational, not just in its composition, but also in its most fundamental structure and ethos. Regiments deliberately mixed nationalities. Let me give you an example, and let's take the 100th Infantry Regiment stationed in Krakow, which was composed of 27% Germans, 33% Czechs, and 37% Poles, all serving together. It's not something most people can even imagine given our more homogeneous armies today. The goal here was to create a military identity that existed above and apart from any single national identity. Now, I don't mean to paint a utopian picture. The system certainly did favor Hungarians and Germans. They were overrepresented in the officer corps and held advantages in promotion. But what I'm trying to get across is that the army wasn't fundamentally a colonial force where one ruling nationality extracted service from subject populations. Different nationalities participated, they advanced, and they built careers. And this distinction matters. It was a multinational institution where ethnic background shaped but didn't determine your trajectory. The monarch Franz Joseph himself embodied this multinational character as well. He wasn't presented as a German emperor who happened to rule over various other peoples, but his official title included Emperor of Austria, Apostolic King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, King of Dalmatia, Croatia, and this continued on and on through about 15 more regional titles that most people at the time couldn't even remember. Now, this absurdly long list had a very specific purpose. It was meant to demonstrate that the monarch represented all these territories and peoples equally, that he was everyone's legitimate monarch, and that his authority derived from all these different crowns rather than from one dominant nationality imposing itself on the others. But there's something missing from that list, and it's what the empire never actually managed to develop. What historians like Peter Sugar call a Reichsgedanke, an imperial idea, a compelling reason people were Habsburg subjects beyond just personal loyalty to the emperor. The empire was only ever able to offer Kaisertreue, loyalty to the Kaiser, and that had worked for centuries. But after the French Revolution transformed how people thought about citizenship and national belonging, which I've spoken about in previous videos, loyalty to a single person wasn't going to be enough anymore. People needed to believe in the state itself, not just the man wearing the crown. And this, to me, is the paradox of the Habsburg world. Its institutions worked, but its constitution didn't. The empire could inspire genuine loyalty to its emperor and to the habits of service that held it together, yet it never created an actual political framework where that loyalty could translate into participation. The parliaments existed, but they were secondary to the crown. The system functioned through loyalty rather than representation. We can see this most clearly in the imperial bureaucracy, which operated on the same multinational principles that defined the army. It was large, sometimes maddeningly slow, but it was authentically inclusive. Ambitious young men, whether they were Czechs, Germans, Poles, or Croatians, could all build careers in it. The system had its hierarchies, but it was not a colonial administration. It was a genuinely multinational machine that people believed in and took pride in serving. Even the empire's infrastructure reflected this idea in physical form. The railways connecting Vienna to Prague, Krakow, Lemberg, and Budapest, they weren't just commercial routes. They were the steel skeleton of an empire that imagined itself as one coherent, interconnected world. Now, controversially in this video, I want to contrast this with the European Union, because in a strange way, the Habsburg Empire accomplished something that modern Europe still hasn't. The European Union has built elaborate institutions and a complex legal order, but none of them generate the kind of loyalty that Habsburg institutions once did. The EU has citizens, but few feel attached to it in the way imperial subjects once felt attached to the monarchy. There is no European army where people from across the continent serve together and form a shared identity. The European Parliament exists, but most citizens can't name their representative. The European Commission issues rules and directives, but it doesn't command a sort of emotional allegiance. Even the euro, an extraordinary achievement of integration, functions as a currency, but not as a symbol of shared destiny. And I'm not just trying to sit here and tear the EU apart, I'm offering constructive criticism. In short, the EU has built the framework of unity without the feeling for it, while the Habsburgs somehow managed the opposite. They built the feeling before the framework. Austria-Hungary, for all of its problems, of which there are many that I have criticized and will continue to criticize, did do this surprisingly well. For generations, it created this sort of authentic supranational idea. People believed in the empire, they served its institutions willingly, they fought for it, and many mourned when it ended. But it goes back to this fundamental contradiction, which I'll now elaborate on in more detail. While the empire was building institutions that did command this loyalty across ethnic lines, it was also creating constitutional structures that rendered all the loyalty politically meaningless. To explain this, I now have to take you back to 1867. By the mid-1860s, the Habsburg Empire was in a severe crisis. It had lost wars against France and Piedmont in 1859, resulting in the loss of most of its Italian territories. Then in 1866 came an even more devastating defeat against Prussia. This effectively ended Habsburg influence in German affairs and raised serious questions about whether the empire could survive at all. The revolutions of 1848 had already demonstrated that national movements were representing an existential threat too. Austria-Hungary desperately needed some sort of new constitutional arrangement that would stabilize the situation and prevent its potential collapse. And that solution would come through the Ausgleich, the compromise with Hungary. The empire would be restructured into two separate kingdoms, Austria and Hungary. Each kingdom would have its own parliament, its own government, its own internal administration and laws. They would share a monarch, maintain a common military, and conduct a unified foreign policy, but otherwise, the two halves would function essentially as two separate states. Initially, the compromise appeared successful. Hungary gained the extensive autonomy that it had been demanding, which satisfied Hungarian nationalist sentiment and secured Hungarian loyalty to the Habsburg crown. The German-speaking populations in the Austrian half maintained their dominant position too, so the system was stable enough that the empire could recover economically and even prosper. The immediate crisis had been diffused. But this was more or less a band-aid, because a fundamental structural problem now existed that grew worse over time. It granted real power and meaningful autonomy to exactly two groups, Hungarians and German Austrians. But then they told every other nationality very explicitly that they would remain in a subordinate position. It froze the empire into a binary dualist system, even though it was fundamentally multinational and included numerous other significant ethnic groups. The Czechs recognized this problem immediately. The compromise gave Hungarians their own separate state within the empire, complete with their own parliament and government, while Czechs remained just another crown land within the Austrian half. There was no coherent principle that explained why Hungarians deserved this status while Czechs didn't. From the perspective of the Czechs, the compromise simply nationalized political power in a way that arbitrarily excluded them, creating resentment. This outcome wasn't inevitable. Czech nationalism in the mid-1800s wasn't separatist. It was more conservative and reactionary, as I've also covered in previous videos. Czech elites initially used nationalist arguments just to protect their privileges against Vienna's centralizing reforms, but they didn't seek to demand independence. To put this into perspective, at the time it was really normal. You were a Bohemian and Imperial, a Czech and a Habsburg, the same way that somebody can be a Texan and an American today, or a Bavarian and a German. But the compromise destroyed that possibility by elevating two nationalities to privileged status while explicitly subordinating everyone else. It transformed defensive nationalism into offensive nationalism. It turned local patriotism into serious separatist movements. The empire didn't face inevitable ethnic conflict, but it created the ethnic conflict by building a constitutional structure that made compromise impossible. The South Slavs, Poles, Romanians, and Italians within the empire all confronted this same problem. Every major nationality now looked and saw a constitutional structure that claimed to represent everyone equally, while actually concentrating power in the hands of Germans and Hungarians. The contradiction was impossible to ignore or accept. And the empire proved completely unable to resolve this fundamental question. Numerous proposals now emerged over the following decades to federalize the empire. The idea was to create some sort of multinational federal structure where all the major groups would have genuine political representation. But none of these reform proposals would go anywhere. The Hungarians consistently blocked them because any change threatened their privileged position. Why would they agree to share power with Slavic populations when they already controlled their own kingdom? The German Austrians too blocked reforms because, well, why would they want to give up their dominance in the Austrian half of the empire? It was these conservative forces throughout the system that opposed any constitutional changes because they opened up questions that were politically dangerous and unpredictable. The empire was essentially trapped. The compromise had created a system that satisfied two groups while alienating everyone else, and that system couldn't be reformed because the two satisfied groups had enough power to prevent any changes. This is the fundamental contradiction and paradox at the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Ordinary people across different cities understood themselves as Habsburg subjects, and they did feel a real connection to imperial institutions. But politically, this loyalty had nowhere to go. If you were a Czech, you could serve the empire, you could fight for it, you could die for it, but you couldn't meaningfully participate in governing it. The constitutional structure locked you out because the real political power was in a German-Hungarian arrangement that excluded you by design. Your identity as an imperial subject was truly authentic, but it was almost politically useless because the compromise had nationalized power in a way that left you voiceless. But let's also be fair to Austria. Any serious attempt at reform was not just risky politically, but it was dangerous practically. The empire was balancing itself on a knife's edge between two governments that were already having trouble coordinating. So adding more national parliaments or granting wider autonomy might have just made the whole constitutional mess that we've discussed completely unworkable. Every new group would have demanded its own powers, its own budget, its own veto, and on, turning an already complicated dual monarchy into a dozen competing governments. So it's not that Vienna and Budapest were just being stubborn for the sake of it. They did genuinely believe that opening up the system would be more dangerous than keeping it as it was. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne, actually understood this problem clearly. He developed plans for federalizing the empire and creating a constitutional structure where Czechs, South Slavs, and other nationalities would gain real autonomy and genuine political representation. He recognized that the compromise was slowly poisoning the empire and that without fundamental reform, the system couldn't survive long term. There's good reason to believe that the Serb nationalists who assassinated him in Sarajevo in 1914 understood this very well. They feared that his reforms might actually succeed in making the empire stable and legitimate, so much so that the South Slavs would choose to remain within it rather than seeking to break away and join Serbia. But Franz Ferdinand's assassination meant that his ideas of reform died with him. A few weeks later, the empire faced the greatest crisis in its history, with a constitutional structure that had never been fixed. Yes, the soldiers continued fighting because institutional loyalty remained very real. They still believed in the army and the dynasty. But back in the civilian world, political leaders from the various nationalities had run out of reasons to believe in the empire. As casualties mounted, as food supplies collapsed, as the war continued year after year with no end visible, nationalist political movements had a simple and devastating argument to make. Why should we continue dying for a political system that refuses to give us any meaningful voice in our own governance? And the empire had no good answer to that question precisely because it had spent 50 years avoiding it. Okay, so to round off our section here on Austria-Hungary, I don't believe we can say that it collapsed just because multinational states are inherently unstable or because ethnic diversity makes political unity impossible. There are simply too many historical examples where that's not the case. But what we can say is that it generated a real supranational identity while simultaneously betraying that through a political system which nationalized all real power, creating the sort of national resentment that would accelerate its eventual collapse. And this matters because the pattern isn't unique to just Austria-Hungary. When you understand what actually killed the empire, you start seeing the same structural problems elsewhere. Alright, here's where I'm going to get grilled by the comments, but before I go to the EU, I just need to acknowledge quickly a disagreement among historians about timing. So, some historians argue that Austria-Hungary's fate was sealed much earlier than 1914. For example, the historian Peter Sugar, which I've already referenced in my video, well, he makes a compelling case that by 1848, different types of nationalism had already crystallized into incompatible forms, making any federal solution impossible. Now, personally, I disagree. I think it's a little too pessimistic. The fact that multinational armies held together through 4 years of devastating war suggests there was still loyalty to work with. But Sugar does make an insight that is really crucial. Every year the empire delayed reform made that reform harder. The longer you postpone necessary changes, the more entrenched positions become, and the more impossible compromise seems. Alright, and now it's time for the comments to grill me. So this is exactly what the European Union is doing right now. So to see why I'm saying this, let me take you back to 2010. Let's teleport back when the Eurozone crisis had just started. Greece stood on the edge of a sovereign debt default. Financial markets were in full panic because everyone understood that if Greece actually defaulted, this crisis would immediately spread to other vulnerable Eurozone countries like Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and potentially Italy. The entire European monetary system faced a potential collapse, and the European Union really had no effective mechanism for responding to this crisis. The underlying problem was straightforward. The EU had a common currency, the euro, without building any fiscal or political infrastructure that normally accompanies a currency union. There was a common central bank, but each country in Europe maintained completely separate national budgets, separate tax systems, separate debt issuance, and separate fiscal policies. So when the crisis hit, there was no European treasury, there's no European bonds that could be issued, no system of fiscal transfers between regions, and no higher political authority with the power to make binding decisions about how to respond. What existed instead was a complicated patchwork of national governments, each answerable to its own voters and its own political constraints, trying to negotiate collective solutions. Germany and other Northern European countries were willing to provide financial assistance to Greece, but only with strict austerity conditions. On the other side of the table, Greece desperately needed that financial support, but didn't want to accept any austerity measures that would further devastate an already complicated economy. Other member states occupied various positions between these poles, each trying to protect their own national interests. And the result was years of crisis management through endless emergency summits that produced temporary agreements which immediately proved insufficient. The European Central Bank stretched its legal mandate to the breaking point, trying to hold the entire system together. Harsh austerity programs were imposed on southern European countries, which produced massive unemployment and enormous political resentment. People across Europe watched their political leaders negotiate deals that fell apart almost immediately, creating a pervasive sense that the whole system was broken, but nobody knew how to fix it. And so why am I telling you all of this? Well, the Eurozone crisis revealed the EU's fundamental constitutional problem with perfect clarity. The system had achieved deep integration in one crucial area, namely monetary policy, without building the necessary political and fiscal structures to support that integration. This is precisely the same structural problem that plagued Austria-Hungary after the Compromise of 1867. So if we take a step back and try to understand what's going wrong, we need to talk about something called legitimacy. It's the basic question of why people accept political authority in the first place. In simple terms, there are two kinds. The first comes from having a say, when people feel they can influence decisions, vote for leaders, and hold them accountable. The second comes from getting results, when a system actually earns trust because it works and delivers stability or prosperity. Political scientists refer to this as input legitimacy and output legitimacy. One legitimacy comes from participation and the other from performance, and nation-states have to balance both. I understand this is getting technical, so let me keep it simple with a quick example. Say your government raises taxes. Now, you might not like it, but you accept it because you voted for a representative who made that decision. Furthermore, you need to go to the hospital, and that was possible because the taxes funded the service you needed. So input and output in this example are working together. Now, I promise we're almost done with the technical stuff, but the EU has structured itself to rely almost entirely on this output legitimacy. The idea being that the European Union was built on a simple bargain. If it could solve problems that other countries couldn't fix on their own, people would accept having less direct control over things. In other words, it doesn't need to be loved, it just needs to work. Now, that approach made sense in the beginning. The EU, after all, started as a project to manage coal, steel, trade, and technical issues that didn't need a mass political debate. What mattered was efficiency and not representation. So as long as the living standards rose and borders stayed open, people were willing to overlook the fact that most European decisions were made by institutions that they didn't really care for. But this is also exactly the trap that Austria-Hungary fell into. The compromise had created deep integration in key areas: a common military, a unified foreign policy, a single customs union, but it had deliberately avoided creating a unified political structure to actually manage the integration. Constitutional ambiguity was actually built into the system's design. This worked adequately during peacetime, just as the euro worked adequately when European economies were growing. But when a serious crisis arrived, the structural mismatch becomes catastrophic. Every attempt to actually fix the structural problem runs into the same obstacle in both cases. Real solutions require someone to give up power, and nobody wants to do that. But why is that the case? I mean, it's not like it's a moral failing or some unique European character flaw. It's just basic political reality. Political actors, whether individuals or institutions or nation-states, naturally work to expand and protect their power and influence. The Hungarians had carved out an autonomous kingdom for themselves through the compromise, so why would they voluntarily dilute by extending the same rights to Czechs or South Slavs? The German Austrians controlled the Austrian half of the empire, so why would they agree to reforms to reduce their dominance? Each group in this situation was acting rationally according to their own interests, defending and expanding the influence they had gained. But that same logic operates in the EU today. Germany doesn't want to accept collective liability for other countries' debts without gaining control over their fiscal policies. Otherwise, you're just handing money out for free. On the other hand, southern countries don't want to surrender their sovereignty over budgets and economic policies. So every member state wants the benefits of a monetary union, the access to larger markets and lower transaction costs, but they don't want to accept the responsibilities that would normally come with a shared currency. They're not being unreasonable or short-sighted, but they're doing what political entities always do, and what they did in Austria-Hungary too. They're protecting their interests and resisting constraints on their power. In essence, the system is designed in a way that makes rational self-interest incompatible with structural reforms. And the EU's response was to do exactly what Austria-Hungary did: choose institutional ambiguity. New mechanisms were created to manage the Eurozone crisis. There was the European Stability Mechanism, the ECB's powers were expanded in ways that arguably exceeded its original legal mandate. Stricter budget rules were imposed on member states, but none of this actually answers the fundamental constitutional question at stake. Is the EU a federation or isn't it? All these measures are half measures. They are institutional patches on a deeper structural problem, ways of muddling through crisis without making hard constitutional choices, which is exactly what the Compromise of 1867 represented. It was a half measure that avoided answering what the empire actually was. But I don't mean to paint a cynical picture. During the Eurozone crisis, there were genuine moments of European solidarity. Countries did help each other. People across Europe recognized that they were economically interconnected, and that one crisis affected everyone. The solidarity was authentic. And if you've watched this far into the video, it should start to sound familiar. Austria-Hungary had it too. Its citizens didn't just obey, they believed. Soldiers, bureaucrats, ordinary people, they all did feel themselves as part of something larger than their own nationality. Just like the European Union today, the Habsburg Empire built institutions that inspired belonging without giving that belonging a real political voice. The EU faces the same problem in a different form. It has solidarity, but no structure to actually carry it. When real decisions need to be made, everything still flows back to national governments protecting national interests. You can feel European unity as much as you'd like, but without a constitutional framework to express it, that feeling can't turn into actual action. And at this point, we come across something more insidious at work here. A trap that makes rational action nearly impossible even when everyone can see the problem very clearly. Austria-Hungary's real dilemma wasn't simply that reform threatened existing power holders, it's that the empire was caught in a timing paradox. Allow me to explain. During peacetime from 1867 throughout the early 1900s, there was no urgent crisis forcing constitutional reform. The system was working well enough. The empire was prospering economically, it was recovering from its earlier defeats, and even expanding its influence in the Balkans. So why would the Hungarians or German Austrians voluntarily give up their privileged positions when everything seemed stable? There was no immediate pressure, no spark, no crisis forcing anyone's hand. And so any real reform proposals could be safely ignored or postponed because there was always time to address them later. It creates a sort of complacency. But when crisis finally erupted with World War I, reform became impossible. You can't restructure your entire constitutional system in the middle of a truly existential war. It's not going to be possible to hold constitutional conventions while your armies are collapsing, or negotiate power-sharing arrangements while your population is starving. The crisis that should have forced reform instead made reform impossible. And here's the cruel irony. The crisis of World War I itself revealed another deficit that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had ignored. Political scientists refer to this as an executive deficit, where there isn't too much executive power, but too little capacity to make decisions quickly and effectively. You see, the empire's compound structure, where power was deliberately divided between Austria and Hungary, meant that in moments requiring rapid decision-making, the system just froze. Every major decision required negotiation between two governments, each answerable to different constituents, which had stabilized the empire during peacetime with checks and balances and a need for consensus, but became fatal during war. You can't fight an existential conflict when your constitutional structure requires every decision to be negotiated between two competing power centers. And the European Union faces both sides to this problem. During the Eurozone crisis, the EU demonstrated executive weakness. There were endless summits, there were temporary agreements that immediately proved insufficient. There was a general inability to make binding decisions quickly, but the solution had been to strengthen executive power without building democratic legitimacy. The result is a sort of asymmetry, institutions that can act but aren't accountable to voters, and elected governments that are accountable but can't effectively act because real power has shifted to the European level. And this is the actual trap. Political systems have a narrow window between not urgent enough to act and too late to act. Right now, during relative stability, there's no crisis urgent enough to force member states to accept real federalization. Countries can keep muddling through, managing each crisis with temporary fixes and emergency measures. Everyone can more or less keep kicking the can down the road because the system hasn't completely broken yet. But when the next major crisis comes, whether it's a financial collapse, a military threat, or some political shock that we can't predict, it will be too late to build the constitutional foundations that Europe would need. You can't federalize during a crisis, you can only federalize to prevent one. And so it's this timing paradox that explains why these systems fail even when the solution may seem clear to outside observers. And so it's not that political leaders are somehow uniquely stupid or short-sighted, it's that the structure itself creates a situation where rational actors who are following their interests during stability inevitably arrive at crisis unprepared. This is because the moment when reform was possible has already passed by the time that reform becomes necessary. Austria-Hungary missed this window. The question is whether Europe will recognize this window is closing before it's too late. So now that we're reaching the end of this video, it's time to ask what we can conclude and learn from any of this. Well, let's start by saying that the conventional lesson drawn from Austria-Hungary's collapse is wrong, but not in the way that most people think. It's not simply that the peoples of the empire couldn't live together, but the system itself couldn't seem to change fast enough to let them. Austria-Hungary had built loyalty, identity, and even love that crossed languages and borders, but it locked that loyalty into a structure that couldn't evolve, and when crisis came, it shattered not from hatred, but from inertia. Now, the European Union isn't the Habsburg Empire, and that's certainly not what I'm trying to say. But what I am trying to say is that it lives with a similar contradiction. Deep integration without deep politics. The machinery itself runs smoothly until it needs to choose a direction. And when performance falters, legitimacy has to come from somewhere else, When output fails, only input remains. When there is no higher constitutional foundation, loyalty begins to turn inward. It fragments, looking for meaning elsewhere, perhaps on the national level. Austro-Hungarian soldiers held the line together through storms of snow in the Carpathians, but they would not survive the storms of politics. And Europe's window today is still open. But windows have a way of closing quietly, long before anyone actually notices the sound. Hi everyone, thank you so much for watching. I just want to take a moment, as I do at the end of each video, to say how incredibly grateful I am for your amazing support. I try my best to read all of your comments, and they often make my mornings and my days. I also wanted to share something exciting. In my spare time, I've been developing a video game called The Infanterist. It's completely free to play and browser-based, with the planned release date being October 26th. If you'd like to learn more about that, stay updated, or just connect with our growing community, you can always join us on Discord using the link below. We play video games with the community, chat, suggest video ideas, and to be honest, it's just awesome to meet with you and talk with you directly as well. So once again, thank you for watching, and as always, stay curious about history.